Hey dudes and dudettes, it's me, E.H. Ivins, and this is another edition of the Radical Reset. Today's question is, how could anybody, and I mean anybody, in the 21st century be a Marxist? Now this comes to mind because this morning I was reading the Wall Street Journal, and by the way, this is Tuesday, December the 1st, and I read an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about Brown University. Now, Brown University, in case you're not familiar with it, is located in Providence, Rhode Island. And just in full disclosure, my cousin Sarah and my cousin Julie are both graduates of Brown University. It's an Ivy League school. It's traditionally a very, very fine school. But it's also traditionally a very, very leftist school. And what they're lobbying to do now, and there's a petition circulating on campus, and I am not saying that it's going to happen, but the very fact that it's taking place on an Ivy League campus in New England should tell us something. What's going on is they're circulating a petition to take down the statues of Caesar Augustus and Marcus Aurelius. Now, if you're not familiar with who Caesar Augustus was, he was the first emperor of Rome. Immediately after the assassination of Julius Caesar, he's the one who did away with, ultimately, Mark Antony and became the first emperor of Rome. And in case any of you, by the way, are judging him by watching shitty, lousy movies like Cleopatra, where Mark Antony is played by, Elizabeth Taylor's, Richard Burton, and, you know, it's supposed to be a heroic. Anyway, he was a piece of shit. Mark Antony was a moron. Caesar Augustus was a giant of history and ushered in what is called Pax Romana. Now, Pax Romana is basically Roman rule of the civilized world and ushered in 200 years of peace. And what the Roman Empire did that makes him particularly deserving of this is, as he expanded the empire, he did two things that were remarkably great that make him, what's the word I'm looking for? They shouldn't be knocking down his statue. Number one is, if you were a conquered country in the Roman Empire, you became a citizen of Rome. You became protected by Rome. And this is a pattern in colonialism that was not copied again until the British Empire. The British Empire is the only other empire I'm aware of that when they took over a people, they made them citizens of the empire, which is remarkably different than becoming, like in the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, or the German Empire, or the Russian Empire, you name the empire, basically a vassal, a servant of the empire. You became a citizen of the empire in Rome, even if you were in a conquered country, with all full rights due to any citizen of Rome. That was the first great thing that he did. And the second great thing that kept in 200 years of peace was that he never became the dictator. While he was the emperor, he was essentially what we would call today a constitutional monarch, and he left ultimate power in the hands of the Senate and the other organizations within the Roman Empire. He was a great, great man. Now, was he a perfect man? No. Was he a man of his time? No. But yes, he was. What am I saying? No. But why did they want to tear a statue down at Brown? Because they feel he's a symbol of white superiority. Now, at the time of the Roman Empire, white supremacy came into being as a movement in the 17th century. Okay, so we're talking 600 years later is when white supremacy came into play. Caesar Augustus wasn't a white supremacist. In those days, race meant nothing. Yes, they had lots of slaves, but they enslaved white people and brown people and every other people. They enslaved themselves. It was more of a class system. Now, that doesn't make it forgivable, but it does take away the argument of white supremacy, and you can't understand it unless you understand the context of the times. So tearing down his statue is just one more example of what I'm going to talk about in just a minute in regards to Marxism. The second statue they want to turn down is Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was one of the great thinkers of all time. Yes, he was an emperor of Rome, but he was also a great thinker, a man who really never wanted to be emperor, and wrote and his works, particularly on Stoicism as a philosophy, which I believe, just digressing slightly, can take the place of religion in our society if we all became Stoics. A Stoic, by the way, just as a sideline, you know, people hear the term take it stoically. That means to accept that bad things happen. That's true, but that's not what Stoicism is. At its base, Stoicism says, for life to have value, it must have purpose. In other words, you have to be doing something constructive to have purpose in your life, and you must conduct yourself ethically, something that I failed at in my life, but all of us are human and we make mistakes, but we should strive to act ethically and have purpose. And this can take the place of religion, and in those days, you know, they had their religion too, Zeus and Apollo and all that other good stuff. I probably just mixed the Greek and the Romans. I just did. I know I did. But anyway, having said that, in the context of his times, and even in the context of today, the writings of Marcus Aurelius stand up. So trying to tear down their statues because they represent a male white patriarchy, which is really what's going on at Brown, tells us a couple of things. The first is that U.S. education has failed, that there is a single student in the United States who thinks that a person who lived 1,000 years ago should be held to a standard of today and doesn't bother to read context and doesn't understand when white supremacy, for example, began and doesn't understand the nature of Marxism and doesn't understand what's gone on, is just a reflection, even at the highest levels. I bring up Brown University because it's the Ivy League. We're talking Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, Penn, and I think that's just a partial list. Who am I forgetting? Is Cornell Ivy League? I don't know. But anyway, to make a long story, Columbia in downtown New York City. But anyway, to make a long story short, these are supposed to be the cream of the crop, okay? And if these kids don't understand history and context, what hope do the rest of America have? Or does I can't conjugate words, obviously. Does the rest of America have in trying to right itself? Now let's get on to the subject. And I'm just giving you, that was just the background of how I got to how could anyone be a communist today? And there are three reasons, or a Marxist. Marxism, communism, socialism are synonymous terms. I understand that people who hold themselves out as so-called democratic socialists say that we're not like those people because they were dictators, but wait, follow with me, you'll see how you cannot have democratic socialism. Ultimately, it ends up in dictatorship for the reasons I'm going to discuss as we go through this. The number one reason why nobody should be a socialist in the 21st century is because of how widely it was tried in the 20th century and how miserably it failed. It also caused the deaths of upwards of 100 million people. Now, we'll never quite know how many people Stalin slaughtered, or how many people Mao slaughtered, or how many people Pol Pot slaughtered, or how many people Nicholas Ceausescu slaughtered, or how many people Josip Broz Tito slaughtered. And I can go down the list of communist dictators. I started with some big countries, but I can run down to a lot of small ones. We've had lots of dictators in socialist countries, and today the most dramatic example of a disaster, not in the making, that's already been made, is Venezuela. Now, here's what socialists say whenever I cite something like this. This is what they say. Anyway, here's what they say. They say they all did it wrong, that we're not going to be dictators, we're democratic socialists, therefore we will do it better. Now, aside from the there we go, that's level now. Aside from the breathtaking arrogance of thinking that you're somehow, everyone else who did it was too dumb, but if you, what the people who are supporting socialism are saying, if we get in charge, it'll all be different. We won't be like Stalin. We won't be like Mao. We won't be like Pol Pot. What we'll be like are, this never having existed before utopian socialist democracy where everybody gets everything equally. Okay, now, it's never worked. And the so-called socialist countries, which a lot of American so-called pseudo-intellectual types from universities like to cite, and political types like Bernie Sanders, is Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway and Denmark, all of whom abandoned socialism in the 1980s. Now, don't confuse socialism with a welfare state. Yes, we have a welfare state. The European countries all have welfare states to one extent or another. In fact, most of the countries of the world do at this point, and they can't afford what they have. Can you imagine if they took over the means of production? Socialism is state ownership of the means of production, and it can take various degrees. Sometimes they take over the banks, like they did in England back in the 20th century, a disaster. Sometimes they take over manufacturing, as they did in many countries in the 20th century, a disaster. Sometimes they nationalize oil companies, like they have in Mexico and in Venezuela, a disaster. Getting the pattern here, every time the government touches a private enterprise and takes over private property, it's a disaster. Now, why is it a disaster, my friends? And why don't kids today understand this? It's interesting. When you poll my generation, baby boomers, only 4% of baby boomers have a positive view of socialism. But 20% of the millennials, my children, do. And that shows a failure of education. 1 out of 5 millennials thinks communism/socialism has a chance to work. And that's because they've read it on paper, or they haven't really read it on paper. They've heard it from their friends, but they aren't thinking. Now, their thought that somehow if they were in charge, let's put aside the hubris and solipsism of that comment and just go to how ridiculous it is. To rise to the top of a system where the state owns the means of production necessarily means that the person that rises to the very top is going to be the biggest motherfucker. Okay, now the reason that is when the state controls production, it's inevitable that it spills over into controlling other things as well. Because the minute you try to enforce equality and the means of production, you have to make judgments that affect millions and millions of people, and nobody, there's never been a person born yet, not Jesus Christ himself, smart enough to understand and anticipate the buying and selling decisions of millions of people, which turns into trillions of decisions when you think just about how many you make every day, and then multiply it, for example, in the United States by 340 million. You probably make, I don't know, 50 small decisions a day, and any of these little small decisions can have a butterfly effect. In other words, you can decide to buy a loaf of bread, and that loaf of bread is the loaf of bread that allows the store to make money that day, and because it made money that day, they had the room in their budget over the course of the month to hire more employees, and because they hired more employees, they were able to expand their floor, and because they were able to expand their store, they were able to sell more goods. But one of the goods they sold, I can go on and on and on and on and on. That's how butterfly effect works. One little thing can affect thousands of other things, and that's why nobody is smart enough. Okay, nobody is smart enough to centrally control an economy. And the idea that equality is something that's good is nonsense. Socialism, I'm going to give you the easiest definition of socialism. Socialism is the manifestation of enviness. Oh, I need a drink of water. I said enviness. That's not even a word. What was I thinking about? Goes to show you that when my mind gets going. Okay, socialism is the system that institutionalizes envy and sloth. Envy and sloth. In other words, being jealous and being lazy, because that's all socialism is. The people out protesting for equality are people who don't trust their own abilities to be able to compete. Let's be honest about it. Capitalism is a process of free decisions in creative destruction. In other words, when a capitalist company, when a free market company doesn't work, it fails. That's the ultimate way we get inefficiency out of the system. There's no other way to do it. There's no nice way. When the government bails out a company like General Motors, we don't know if that's a mistake yet. Yeah, it looks like in the context of 2008 that might have been a good decision. But wait a minute, was it a good decision? Because we printed trillions of dollars out of thin air in the 2008 bailout. Now we've printed trillions of dollars more in the 2020 bailout. This chicken's going to come home to roost. And so what looks like a good decision in the present becomes a bad decision in the future because no one ever thinks about consequence. And even if they do think about consequence, they can't possibly anticipate it because, again, nobody is smart enough to anticipate what motivates 340 million people or 7 billion people worldwide and the trillions, if not quadrillions, of decisions they make that all have a butterfly effect, that all affect how the economy goes, and therefore socialism cannot work. And it's a system based on envy. Look, the word equality, and we should be teaching this to our kids in school, it's impossible to have an equal outcome in a system. If you manage the outcome, which is the problem with all progressivism, progressives and socialists look at a problem and they look at the outcome they want to get and then they try to work backwards from it. So in other words, if you look at a poor person versus a rich person, then if you're working backwards, the obvious way to get a poor person richer against a rich person is to take the money away from the rich person and give it to the poor. Now what's missing from that equation is there's a reason why the poor person's poor, and that's because he or she is a schmuck. Okay, now let's put aside the ill or the severely disabled. That's not what I'm talking about, and within a compassionate society, we can certainly, and I believe at the state and local level, take care of, in conjunction with private charity, those of us who are truly needy. But the vast majority of people, and any of you have been around, when I was in prison, I met a lot of people who were collecting Social Security disability. It's a fucking racket. It's a phony waste. My son's in the car business. He'll tell you that people come down all the time buying cars on Social Security disability. It's a racket. It's a giant fraud machine. And it's one example of, but anyway, I'm digressing. I don't want to get into Social Security today. But equality of outcome, since when are human beings equal? Now, we're equal in the eyes of God if you believe in God, or certainly we have value as human beings that are all equal. I'm not advocating hurting human beings, but the idea that one human being has the same talent, ability, and education, and native smarts, and street smarts, and all the things it takes to be truly wealthy, not to mention being innovative, is ludicrous. Most people are not. Most people are just average, and most people do averagely. Now, here's the real question. Yes, it's true, the rich in the last 20 years, since the turn of the century, have gotten very, very rich. Their wealth has gone up 130%. That's a true statistic, by the way. But the wealth of the poor, the very poorest in our country, has gone up 30% in a free market, and would have gone up a lot more if we didn't have all these fucking programs. Because here's the problem with socialism. Socialism, again, works backwards. Looks at a problem, inequality, takes money from the rich to give to the poor, but what they're really doing is taking money out of the deep end of the pool to pour it into the shallow end. And then the money goes right back to the deep end, because the reason people are poor isn't because of their color or their gender. That's all a bunch of bullshit. Don't listen. The popular media, puts out ideas that just aren't true. There is no wage gap between the genders, and there are only two genders, by the way. And there is no age gap between them. Wage gap between them. Those numbers, when they're put out, are never adjusted for childbirth, second incomes, part-time income. There are a lot of factors that go into play when you take all those factors out and you just analyze a job. A woman seeking a job against a man, one-on-one in this environment. Take all family and children out of it, just one-on-one, the woman will make as much or more, actually statistically, slightly more than the man, because women tend to be more educated than men as a rule. Same is true with black people. Black people who have played the game and have taken part in the system are just as wealthy as white people. Yes, there is an enormous black underclass, but that's not a product of capitalism. That's a product of socialism and the welfare state, making these people into lifelong victims where they don't realize that they can go out and compete. And that is the destruction of a socialist system, as much as we've adopted it in our own country. You cannot get ahead through envy and laziness. It just isn't going to work. Being jealous of Bill Gates, okay, you're jealous, but he didn't take his money from you. In other words, his wealth is created. That's what so many of these socialists, and another thing we need to teach in our schools. It's not a casino. There doesn't have to be a loser for every winner. The beautiful thing about capitalism is when you win, your wealth is created. You didn't take it from anybody else. You created it. Capitalism is a voluntary system. Nobody does business with anybody else unless they want to. Right now, for example, Amazon is killing it in online trade, but if Walmart comes out with a better platform or somebody you've never heard of, they can put Amazon out of business tomorrow. When I was a kid, the largest retailer in the world was SS Kresge, a name that you don't even know. SS Kresge is Kmart. That's where the term Kmart came from. And if you don't know what Kmart is, and if you're young, you don't, it's because they went broke too. And when I was a kid, they were the largest retailer in the world. The second largest retailer in the world was Sears. Sears and Roebuck. If you don't know who that is, I don't blame you. You're young. They're bankrupt. There are a few of them left, but they're largely gone. Why are they gone? The creative destruction of capitalism. Companies like Amazon and Walmart killed them. Okay, JCPenney is on its way out as we speak. What should we do about that? Nothing, because what replaces it is better, more efficient, and provides better goods and services to the average person. And anytime the government takes it upon itself to take over, even to a limited extent, the means of production and or private enterprise, it always, 100% of the time, fucks it up. Look what's going on today in the government holding hearings in the House and the Senate to regulate the internet. That's going to be a fuck shit show. And this is a good example. If you were educated, you'd never fall for this. They're arguing, for example, that Google is a monopoly. Now, first of all, that's not true. There are other search engines out there besides Google. There are several. That's number one. Number two, there will be more in the future. Number three, Google offers its services free. The problem behind monopolies, even if Google was monopoly, is always that they can price fix and they can fuck the public. But Google provides its services for free. So in other words, it makes its money by the embedded advertising, the stuff at the top of the searches and things like that, again, customers voluntarily pay for. So the question is, how can you have a monopoly, a destructive monopoly, in a business where A, you still have competition, B, there's no barrier to entry to new competition, and C, you're providing your product for free? Well, you can't. But these old fuckers in the Senate, and they're all my age and older, but they aren't as technological. I mean, I sat there and watched Dianne Feinstein try to figure out how the internet worked, and it made me just chuckle. And so many senators are like that. I mean, who was I watching that didn't understand the most basic things? Was it from Utah? I forget what it was. Anyway, it was one of the, it just was ridiculous. I mean, they ask questions like they don't know how to use a smartphone, because they don't, because their aides carry them around. And these people, the government, is regulating us. Can you fucking believe that? And they're what makes it all worse is government-run schools are indoctrinating our young into this stupid shit. In other words, public schools are the greatest poison in America today, in that they teach a watered-down, politically correct, union-approved curriculum that's fucked in the head. Our kids don't know about Caesar Augustus. Our kids don't know about Marcus Aurelius. Our kids are taught that America began in many schools in 1619, which is bullshit. They're taught about a legacy of slavery that doesn't exist. They're taught about a history that doesn't exist. They're taught a twisted, screwed up, and at the base of it are socialists and progressives who all believe that if they get in charge, they'll somehow avoid the 100 million deaths caused by communism/socialism/Marxism in the 20th century. And for you to believe that, if you are watching me now and you believe that socialism can work, you are one self-centered motherfucker and stupider than a pile of shit. I mean, really, let's think about it. Nobody has ever gotten that right. Nobody. Not one country. Not Sweden, not Russia, not China, not Norway, not Denmark, not Vietnam, not Thailand, not Cambodia, not Laos, not Venezuela, not Mexico, not Chile before they threw them out, not any of them. It just simply, Nicaragua's a fucking basket case. It is not some kind of fucking coincidence that every shitdog country in the world is a socialist/Marxist country in one form or another, and to the extent that they are socialist or Marxist, is to the extent that they impoverish their own people. The only equality in socialism is poverty. Socialism has succeeded in making people equally poor. That's it. That's the extent of its success, and it kills a shit ton of people because in a system where the state owns the means of production, the worst rise to the top because you have to be ruthless. When you control everything and everybody's competing with you for the power to control everything, literally everything, then only the worst rise to the top. Use your head. Nice guys finish last in that contest, and ultimately it always ends up in dictatorship. It starts as a democracy, then it becomes a social democracy, and then slowly but surely they start putting in barriers to entry to competition of other parties because they're the compassionate ones, and they're the ones who are looking out for you and looking out for equality, and they're the ones who are going to give you something for nothing, and then ultimately we get to the point where we run out of money, we can't afford it anymore, and the whole thing crashes in on itself after it kills tens of millions of people. So how could anyone be a fucking socialist in the 21st century? And the answer is, you can't. And that's my message for today. So those of you who have children, and those of you who have friends who believe even a shred of the socialist bullshit, ask them, why are they so envious? Why are they so lazy? And how do they ignore 100 million dead people? And when they say that we'll be able to do it better, what they're really saying is they'll be able to do it better. And what makes them any smarter than you? Do you think there is anybody smart enough to anticipate the quadrillions of decisions made on behalf of millions and billions of people worldwide privately and can somehow control it without oppressing them? And the answer is you can't. It's impossible. You can't control without oppression. Period. End of story. Socialism sucks. And to take its place, that's why. Now, that's not to say our system doesn't suck pretty bad, because it really does, because of the corruption of politics, which is why I invented Antipolitism. Pick up your copy of A Radical Reset, the manifesto of Antipolitism. Democracy by selection, not election. A system that does away with elections and money and is still more democratic than the system we have, more representative than the system we have, will work better than the system we have. It's not perfect, but it is almost perfect, and it's the ultimate expression of what government can be when it's done properly and correctly. I encourage you again to pick up a copy. You can get this, you can either pick up this paperback copy on Amazon, or you can download it to your Kindle or other reading device, or if you're an Amazon Prime member, which we all are, you can borrow it for free from the Kindle Lending Library. And when you do, every time you turn a page, I get paid a tiny little fraction of a cent, and that helps support this podcast and helps support the movement, which is only in the beginning, but is going to grow. And it's going to grow because of what I'm going to talk about in the next podcast, which are my predictions for 2021, which will scare the shit out of you, so stay tuned for that. Okay. That's it for today. Okay, click the notification button. If you haven't done it already, make sure you click the subscriber button above my head. If you want to get involved in the movement, and I need people to get involved in the movement, come join me by texting Antipolitism above to 844-935-0444, and I will share with you how to get involved. For those of you who are texting me over the holiday, don't worry, I'll be back with you in the next week or so. I was simply vacationing in the mountains, caught the biggest trout of my life, by the way. Not that it was that big, it was a 3-pounder, but you know, I tend to catch these little stocky. Those of you who fish know what I'm talking about. Anyway, it was great. Thank you very, very much for joining me. Enough digression into my Thanksgiving holiday. Happy Thanksgiving to you. Merry Christmas to you. Happy Hanukkah. I realize I'm an atheist, but I'm going to wish warm wishes to everybody, because while I'm an atheist, I'm not an asshole. I want all of you to celebrate your family, celebrate your life, celebrate your freedom, celebrate your liberty, and become anti-politists with me. And until next time, this is E.H. Ivins, signing off.